Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another Three Gins production with myself, Smmmile, and my other two Gin co-hosts, Dave.
Hi.
And Drastic Measures.
Everyone.
Yeah, we had such a nice, lovely time doing the last one. We've decided to produce another video for you. We're going to have a look at a video on the EFDawah channel called Islam and Slavery, Debunking the Narrative. Should be good. You guys ready?
Yep.
Looking forward to it.
Okay.
Can I ask more questions?
Please,
Okay.
let Dr. Imran come in. Answer them.
So this is another issue that he had. It was about concubines,
Yes.
so female sex slaves, and he was saying how, firstly,
To be corrected, there's no such thing as sex slaves, but
this is what they say, right?
Yeah, but
Like,
this is a term that's used. But this is not a concept within Islam to have a sex slave. It doesn't exist. This is a very recent way of wording it, which has very unfortunately very loaded connotations. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Does anybody think that this is just like, playing with words? I mean, concubine or sex slave, it amounts to the same thing, and to insist that one use of language is somehow fundamentally different to the other doesn't really make any difference. I mean, a concubine is, in essence, a sex slave.
That's exactly what it is. It's playing a semantic game, isn't it? It's pretending that you give it this different name, then it isn't everything that a sex slave is, which is somebody who is forced to have sex with you. It's no different under Islam. Doesn't matter how you're going to name it.
Yep.
Yeah, it's about the words that trigger ideas and thoughts that they don't want to be associated with Islam. But yeah, here we find ourselves again talking about topics like this in relation to Islam, so it doesn't seem like a coincidence, really.
I shall continue.
So, firstly, I'll tell you how I tried to answer it. I said, look, like, firstly, this is in a war context, right? Where a lot of the times the women aren't like today where they're independent, they can work for themselves. They were very much dependent upon the man to provide for them. Now, if their husbands are all getting killed, who are they going to be dependent upon? They'll probably like starve to death. They'll probably literally die. And so, of course, being a concubine, I mean, that's why we have that, right? It's because it's an element of taking care, okay? But obviously, one of his questions was the fact that are they forced to have sex, for example, with the person who takes them in, and also, with our right hand possesses them,
Yes.
etc. So are they forced? Do they just have to follow what they've been told now, just because they were the wife of one of the enemies? Are they simply just?
I'll let Dr. Imran answer the question.
Sure.
But let me ask you a question.
Can I just pause for a sec? Yeah, I thought it would be useful just to give a quick definition for the word concubine, because it's obviously coming up. So just putting it up on Google, a woman who lives with a man but has lower status than his wife or wives. Is that a good definition there?
Well, yeah, as for the word concubine, but
Yeah.
this is it. Is that what Islam's describing? I would say no.
So what would you say would be a definition that fits in? It's probably to do with sexual slavery, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's basically that they're chattel property. These are not women simply of a lower status. They are owned as property.
Yeah, I agree.
Moving forward.
Yeah.
Friend though, because I don't mean this disrespectfully, really, I don't. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is he knowledgeable about Islam?
Honestly speaking,
Yeah.
in my opinion, I'd say he is, because he's the one who got me.
But I got you practicing is alhamdulillah.
And he was saying some very good arguments. Like, he was very passionate.
No, but there's a difference between people like me,
Yeah.
who are passionate, and I don't have the knowledge that mashallah Dr. Imran or other brothers have.
Yeah.
There's a difference between me maybe persuading somebody to mashallah come back into the deen.
Yeah.
It doesn't make me a scholar.
No, of course.
It doesn't make me a very learned person. It just may mean that alhamdulillah I could maybe formulate the answer or the discussion in a way that, mashallah, the person found persuasive, right? Yeah. But I'm talking about actual knowledge, because this particular questions that you've raised to me, somebody with sort of like a basic to moderate knowledge of Islam wouldn't really have a problem with these things, or actually even have the question in the first place. But I'll let Dr. Imran come in there.
So actually I did a video on this long time on EFDawah, you can find it.
Sure.
And there was a person who, a Christian, ex-Christian, who became a Muslim, who then became a Christian again.
Sorry if I'm looking at my phone, I'm just
So maybe we should just tell the camera to go to the video there, and you can that Dr. Imran made about this very same subject of concubines.
Yeah, and it's the problem with this is that it's nothing is put into its context and no one understands it properly. What they're doing is that they're just taking something without trying to understand it and thinking it's something that's negative necessarily.
Has anybody seen that video, by the way?
Oh, I've not watched it myself.
I forget the name of the chap involved. Sorry, Smmmile, have you?
I did try. It was a little difficult. And I was thinking the whole time, so the Most Merciful Creator gave you such convoluted guidance on how not to own sexual slaves. It takes you 45 minutes to unpack. That's incredible.
The main contention, the chap in the video that Imran was rebutting, his main contention were those kind of primary hadiths from Bukhari about that there was a raid and they captured some women, and basically that Muhammad basically gave the thumbs up for his men to have sex with those women, not to use the withdrawal method because it was pointless, because Allah was going to dictate who had a baby or not. But the other hadith that the chap mentioned was in relation to the kind of enforced divorce, that a woman whose husband was still alive, perhaps a Christian woman who had a husband already who was still alive, that once they were captured, they would be essentially divorced. And you have to wonder why would that be the case if there was an intention to sleep with them. I mean, the reason given is because the men were uncomfortable sleeping with married women. But Muhammad basically says it's perfectly fine, they're no longer married. And I mean, that's pretty dark kind of way of looking at marriage, really, where you can just arbitrarily divorce somebody, without their consent. And this, again, was in the cause of his men getting their rocks off.
Yeah.
So, I'll try, because there's a lot of things. It's a 45-minute video, right?
Okay, sure.
So there's a lot of things to unpack. Yeah. So let me just give you a few basic things. So the question you're asking, can you force women to have into intercourse with you if they're your slaves? Yeah? That's the question. And the assumption is being made because they're your slaves, they can't refuse, and therefore you can do this. Okay. There's a few things. The first thing is, this is an argument from silence. What do I mean by this? There is no recording in any hadith. There's no recording in any Quranic verse. There's no recording in any Syrian literature of women being raped afterward. None. So the people who argue this, they argue implicitly. They argue from the verse that the women prohibited to you are blah 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 blah, and the women that you can marry and can't marry, these are the prohibited to you, and the only ones you can have intercourse or marry are the ones who are your wives or the ones who your right hand possesses. So they assume this means because you are allowed, because there's an allowance of intimacy in this particular context. We talk about them. Well,
can we stop for a sec?
Of course.
Yeah, so I thought this was a nice switch from Imran. So usually when Muslims do something horrible in the name of their faith, we're told Islam is perfect, but Muslims are not. Now he's basically saying in this circumstance here, we should judge Islam by the testimony of what Muslims did in this case. So now we're looking at the actions of Muslims, and we're supposed to ignore the sections of the Hadith and the Quran which legitimize sexual slavery. So he wouldn't use this tactic in any other discussion. Definitely not, because usually Muslims would be said to fall short of the Quran in many instances. But now he's saying, look at Muslims, they didn't do what we're describing.
Yeah, and of course we know that the use of the word rape won't feature in the language of these descriptions because by the definitions and the allowances made in the Quran and elsewhere, that this is halal. So rape in Islam is part of zina, in which it's only when the woman in question doesn't belong as property to the master or isn't married to him. And only in that case would it be considered rape for a man to randomly stumble upon a random woman and sexually assault her. That would be rape. But to have sex with your slaves or your wife can't be considered rape because it's all halal.
Yeah.
I think this is the key thing, isn't it? It's almost kind of it's trying to define rape out of existence by saying that the issue of consent is just irrelevant in terms of if you are allowed to have sex with them, then it's not rape, regardless of how that woman feels about it. And as a slave, you have to obey. And obviously we'll get into the details of that later in the video, but it's almost like trying to define it out of existence by saying, you know, any modern definition of rape would say it's without consent. So it's kind of similar to the first video we did when we were looking at child marriage. It's the issue of consent just doesn't seem to exist in the same way in Islam as it does in many other forms of legal systems, etc. So I think it's a kind of point of weakness within Islam in the way that we can just say, oh, well, rape doesn't exist because we're just going to describe it differently.
Yeah, it's like an internal external thing. From an external point of view, us here in the modern day, basically consent plays a big part in any sexual assault, or the lack of consent, I should say. And of course, they're just phrasing it in their internal way of looking at it, which is it's halal, so rape doesn't exist there.
And you know you're always guaranteed a good conversation where the first thing that happens when you discuss a topic like this, they go, well, all right, well, what does it mean to rape? Or what does it mean to have sex with a slave? As if the glaringly obvious definitions don't apply.
Yeah. Shall I move forward?
Let's go for it.
I don't know
So we'll talk about this.
Yeah.
So this is a title given to a group of people. Do you understand? And so what we're doing is we're reading into the language, English language, to see if it had negative connotation. Again, it's just an implicit thing. So the question is can you force yourself on these women? That's the question, isn't it? So let me broaden it out. There were a group of companions, 7 brothers. They had one slave girl amongst them. She used to cook for them. Yeah. The youngest of them brothers got angry one day and he slapped her. Okay. She came to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and she said that this person slapped me. So the brothers came, and they came to the Prophet and they said, you know, our youngest brother got angry and he slapped. They didn't mean to do it. Yeah. They were apologetic. What was the Prophet's ruling?
To not hit.
Free her.
Just immediately
free her. Now I'm asking you a question.
You got some resource on that, haven't you, Smmmile? So
yeah, I mean, so the story sounds quite unique. I mean, perhaps not particularly unique, but unique enough to find it. And a quick search of sunnah.com reveals that it does actually have in Sahih Muslim, one of the canonized books of Hadith, there is a section, a chapter on the treatment of slaves. And this story does come up. It is Sahih Muslim 1658b. And I'll just read it out. It says, it's you could find no other part to slap but the prominent part of her face. See, I was one of the 7 sons of Makarin, and we had but only one slave girl. The youngest of us slapped her, and Allah's messenger commanded us to set her free. So that sounds like the story that they're talking about there. And notice it's the person narrating saying that he was a son of Makarin. And that's quite important because there are other hadiths, other perspectives on this particular incident, and they do mention this name as well, so you know that they're all related. The strange thing is that they're quoting this story, and apparently the slave gets hit and she's released immediately. You'll hear them say that quite a lot. Immediately, she's immediately released. And they're trying to indicate then that if you abuse your slave in any minor way, you are to release them. So it isn't slavery as we understand it. So this was the Hadith 1658b. If you only move one Hadith prior to this, you'll get a slightly different version. And let me read that out to you. I slapped a slave belonging to us and then fled away. I came back just before noon and offered prayer behind my father. He called him, the slave, and me and said, "Do as he has done to you." He granted pardon. He then said, "We belong to the family of Makarin," again that name, Makarin, "during the lifetime of Allah's Messenger, may peace be upon him, and had only one slave girl, and one of us slapped her. This news reached Allah's Apostle, and he said, 'Set her free.'" So up until this point, the story, the narratives as they've described it. But the extra part here is the members of the family then said, "There is no other servant except she," so implying perhaps that, you know, they need her. Thereupon Allah's Apostle said, "Then employ her, and when you can afford to dispense with her services, then set her free." And that's Sahih Muslim 1658a. So literally one previous hadith. And that tells a slightly different story. It doesn't sound quite immediate, and it doesn't sound perhaps like she was ever released at all, because maybe they just didn't want to dispense with her services.
Yeah, there appears to be no actual requirement on them to actually release her for the foreseeable future, if at all. I mean, where is the punishment in this? You know, I just don't see it.
There's another issue here. It's a bit of a dodge in terms of how Imran has done this, because it starts off by saying the question is, can you force yourself upon your slave? In other words, can you have sex with her? And he goes on to talk about hadith, which has nothing to do with whether you can have sex with your slave or not. It's simply about another incident which is vague enough that even if Muhammad is ordering her to be free, you don't know what, there could be other circumstances which kind of lead to that particular thing happening. The point is, it's got nothing to do with whether they're allowed to have sex with her or not. So his argument is kind of spurious, because it's almost like, well, if slapping her is enough for her to be set free, then how could you be allowed to have sex with her? Well, if Islam allows you to have sex with your slave anyway, then this is completely irrelevant.
No, it is a dodge, isn't it?
Well, it's kind of a bait and switch. It's kind of like, I'm going to pretend to answer this. Here's the question you're putting to me, and my answer is something completely different, which is irrelevant. So we're no closer to the actual question of, can you have sex with your slaves?
And you also
and the larger question being, are they allowed to refuse?
Go ahead, Smmmile. You were going to say something.
You go first, because I want to quickly read out two other hadiths as well, which are right again next to that particular one he's quoting, and again they give a different version of what happens when you beat your slave, and they're not the same as how he's describing it. So, but before I read that, why don't you go ahead?
No, that's exactly where I was going to suggest we go. In relation to, is it actually, does it necessarily lead to the freedom of a slave by hitting them? And I think these hadith you're about to discuss are going to cover that. Yeah.
So this there's not Sahih Muslim 1657b, and I'm just quoting a portion of it. He who beats a slave without cognizable offense of his or slaps him without any serious fault, then expiation for it is that he should set him free. So there seems to be a mechanism in this hadith to say you can judge whether there was a reason to beat your slave, and if there was such a reason and if it was valid, then the freeing of the slave shouldn't apply to you. So again, we aren't getting this immediate freeing of slaves that Imran is describing. We're getting some more nuanced discussion happening around that event.
That's a great point, because I mean, and this is what I was kind of mentioning, when you don't know the circumstances around it. This particular situation could have been, well, Muhammad judged that there was no rhyme or reason to it. It was just a cold act of savagery, and therefore she should go free. Whereas similar situation, Muhammad could have just judged it as, oh no, you know, she was talking back, you know, she was being rude, she was, you know, doing something that was unslaved like, you know, just wasn't even obeying your commands, perhaps, you know, as a slave is supposed to, and so therefore you wouldn't be set free and you could hit them. So yeah, that hadith is brilliant, because it shows it is not an unconditional situation that if you just hit your slave then they have to go free. It's absolutely conditional on whether they're at fault, you know, whether they've done something which, you know, they're breaking the rules as a slave. So it completely undercuts what you're saying. I think it's a great hadith to bring up.
And again, for anyone, that was 1657b from Sahih Muslim. This last one I'm going to just quickly read out. It's actually a lot more darker, because there is no discussion here of the slave being freed at all. And this one's quite harsh. So this one starts with, I was beating my slave with a whip when I heard a voice behind me, understand, Abu Masud, but I did not recognize the voice due to intense anger. He reported, as he came near me, I found that it was the messenger of Allah, and he was saying, bear in mind, Abu Masud, bear in mind, Abu Masud. He said, he threw the whip from my hand. Thereupon he, the Holy Prophet, said, bear in mind, Abu Masud, verily Allah has more dominance upon you than you have upon your slave. I then said, I would never beat my servant again in future. So in this case, the Prophet didn't, the action was a lot more harsher, because it wasn't just a slap, as we were talking about when Imran was talking about the story. This one was somebody whipping their slave, and the Prophet comes upon this, and there's no discussion about freeing the slave here. And in fact, it doesn't look like the slave was freed, but the owner has made some sort of repentance. But again, there's no discussion about freeing the slave or what happens to the slave after you whip them. And that's Sahih Muslim 1659a.
Yeah, or any other kind of punishment, you know.
Yeah.
It's really, oh, you're being a bit naughty doing that. Don't do it again. I mean, it's...
I'd just like to make, as an aside point, we hear this all the time from Dawah apologists to say that the slavery in Islam is nothing like, say, the transatlantic slave trade, you know, the slavery from Europeans and what was carried into North America. Doesn't this just sound like a slave master on a cotton plant whipping their slave? I mean, where is the difference? I mean, you're using a classic kind of, you know, trope of how slaves were beaten in the African slaves taken North America. It's textbook same language, and yet they'll try and pretend, no, this is a completely different institution. I think that hadith just is a great example of how that's a complete lie.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny how he didn't quote this one. He quoted the other ones, but not this one.
But this just shows how convenient it is when you have this many hadiths, which are all sahih, if I'm not mistaken. You can cherry pick your way into a potentially softer version of Islam, as long as you're willing to pick one hadith and ignore the other three.
They are all sahih, at least as verified by Sunnah.com.
It seems, we kind of talked about this before, haven't we? It seems almost incomprehensible that you'd have a society in which slavery was practiced, in which actually laying hands on your slave would lead to their freedom. I imagine that just simply couldn't work. A slave could provoke an incident such that they were hit, and that would be enough for them to get their freedom. If they just were walking away, leaving. I think you made this point a while back, Drastic. How would you stop them leaving? Because as soon as use physical force to stop them, they would be free.
Well, yeah, by definition, the institution of slavery cannot exist without physical coercion. I mean, it's what underlies it, because nobody is going to want to choose to be a slave if they can just walk out the fucking door. So it's absolutely ridiculous to, Imran and Abbas are not the only Muslim apologists who will try and hint at this, as if slavery was just so wonderful under Islam that coercion just wasn't even really needed. And it's ridiculous. Yeah, I mean, it underpins slavery. It has to be the threat or the use of violence, otherwise the thing would collapse instantly.
Yeah, going back to those hadith about the captured women, would it not enter into their heads, these captured women, that if they could just leave, they could return to their husbands?
Exactly, yeah. We just walk away. I mean, we've got the choice to have, let's use the Islamic rhetoric, to have intimacy, as I think Imran said, with these complete strangers who are enemy soldiers, or we can just get up and leave. Yeah, no, in their version, they've chosen to stay there.
Yeah.
Can anyone take that seriously?
Of course not. Shall we move on? Take it as a yes.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I just quickly, sorry, I just wanted to say as well, you'll get probably a lot of discussions with some Muslims who will say how great, the whole paradigm of slavery was. It wasn't anything like how we feel it is today, but how great it was is circumvented according to this story that they give, that all of the benefits and all of the quote unquote luxury of slavery, getting to eat the same food as the master and getting the same clothes and everything, all of that is circumvented as soon as you slap them in this trivial way that Abbas is describing, because then slavery isn't anything beneficial, and you let them go. I find that just quite amusing, that all of the benefits that supposedly of Islam are just sort of thrown away, and suddenly it's better to free a slave in that circumstance. And obviously we know in the end that story just wasn't as it was told. That slave probably stayed there a long time after that.
Yeah, I doubt she was ever released.
There's this constant contradiction that on the one hand it's a noble act to free a slave, but then at the same time there's no moral problem with being a slave. And I think it will come up in later parts of the video where it'll be more directly talking about that, so maybe we could spin on. But it's a good point that there's this contradiction. They want to argue both sides of this, even though they're kind of mutually exclusive in terms of around the issue of slavery. But
yeah, and also as well, there's no discussion here to say actually slavery is intrinsically wrong, so you should anyway release a slave. It's like you've done something bad, and here's your punishment that happens to be something that's going to cost you financially, and that's what it seems like to me as I read these. It doesn't seem like you're releasing slaves because it's good. This seems like retaliation for something you've done wrong.
Yeah, I agree. That is mostly how it's delivered in Islam. I would say there are a few little examples I found here and there where it's talked about, it's considered a noble act or a moral act. But yeah, generally speaking, it tends to be you've been a bad Muslim, so here's your punishment for your slave. But
I was reading a hadith earlier on where Aisha talks about taking the money she's given and basically manumitting slaves, and somebody takes her to task. They call it mishandling the money, and she has a bit of a conflict with them, and they eventually persuade her to talk with them to kind of because she's in the wrong for not speaking to them anymore, because they're trying to stop her do this good thing. And and in that account, Aisha is claimed to have released up to 40 slaves. So,
wow.
Crack on anyway, because otherwise this will take all night. I think. As great as this conversation is, let's do a bit more of the video.
all right.
Now we're establishing criteria here. Now I'm asking you a question. If the Prophet didn't allow a woman who was to be slapped, would he allow that woman to be raped? 100% no.
I wasn't aware of a source like that.
Where is? If you look at this video, which you'll find here, you'll see all the references are there for you.
Okay, I'll take a look.
So that's a really important principle.
If I known that, I would have told him. I would have told
you can
him.
just send him the video.
This is the point about Islam. Islam is not about getting snippets and making an entire elaborate, scenario from a little snippet of information. What the scholars will do is what Imran just showed you. They will say, okay, what are all of the rights that we find? What are all of the hadith, the Quranic statements pertaining to what your right hand possesses? What does that even mean?
I mean, the irony is dripping there, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm just thinking we have the greatest scholar here, and his name is Smmmile, because he's done the very thing that they're claiming they've done. Smiles has shown 4 hadiths to qualify the position, and it's completely different to how they're portraying it. They're the one using the snippets. I mean, it's hilarious.
Well,
and actually, I literally just looked 2 hadiths before and after. That was it. It was wow. That's a bang-up job on the research there, Dr. Imran.
Yeah, completely nailed it, Imran. Moving forward.
And then they will look at all of these things, and then they will say that if the injustice of even a slap was not tolerated by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and he instructed them, free her now, immediately.
You can infer that rape is a...
So the scholars will say, rape is a very big thing, astaghfirullah.
Yeah, of course.
Yes? And so these are some of the things that are nuances that are often missed within these discussions, really. But as I said to you, even a very basic amount of knowledge of these subjects would actually completely satisfy you that such activity is not allowed. And the other thing is this: if the Muslims enter into a treaty with other nations that we're going to stop this practice of slavery, which is riq, which is not slavery in the the sense of transatlantic slavery, that's never accepted in Islam. But the war prisoners of war.
Did you understand that word, Rick?
I think so, but I'm not particularly sure. I couldn't find any references to it.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems like the transatlantic slave industry to me. So, I don't know what distinction that word would make.
I just love that bit as well, where he says, if Muslims enter into an agreement with non-Muslim nations to end slavery, although it's not really slavery, it's like, well, then why do you need an agreement with non-Muslim nations to end it if it's not slavery? I mean, and it also just points, just as another side note, to the actual history as we know it. Because he's mentioning real things. At the end of the day, it was non-Muslim nations in 99% of cases that pressured Muslim countries to end slavery. It was almost, I've found one historical example, which was, I think it was Tunisia in the 19th century, where there was kind of internal efforts to end slavery by the Muslim ruler, and he was under heavy kind of influence from French kind of intellectuals and kind of politicians stuff, and who he was talking to. Other than that, it's always been non-Muslims saying you can't carry this on. So, which again, a bit of a sidetrack, but it does relate to what they're going to talk about later when they're talking about Islam supposedly coming there to end slavery. Well, it failed in basically every case, and it took non-Muslims forcing them. So, but yeah, sorry, getting a little bit ahead of myself.
Yeah, I think Smile's got a little more data on that. We'll come to that in a minute, I guess.
Mm.
Okay.
and the concubines, if the Muslims agree that society has moved on, where we don't need this anymore because governments are able to look after their own people, where they are now fed and they are clothed and they're in safety, and that we agree by this treaty, then the Muslims would have to abide by that treaty, and that you could outlaw such practices. You understand my point? There's so many nuances here. But what people look at it as, oh, this must mean this, that's a horrible thing, how can that be from God? No.
Yeah, I mean, and this is one thing, like, I mean, he was shocked when I said this, but obviously slavery, not referring to transatlantic slavery, I said it's justified. I think it's necessary in order to restore order and security and peace. For those times, slaves are necessary.
So I would see, this is very interesting because there's a great book by Professor Jonathan Brown on slavery.
I think that's
and it's quite noisy here. Should we move down a little bit?
Jonathan Brown.
No, he wrote this because he's a professor of Hadith.
Oh, okay.
So he wrote this. Now, I want to make just new because now there's lots of topics now. I'm just going to give you a little nutshell. So there's this. What's the surah? So I think it's Surah Al-Balad.
What should we tell you? What is?
Okay. I'll find it for you actually, where it talks about the high path and the low path. Allah says, "I have given you alam naj'al lahu aynayn wa lisana wa shafatayn wa hadaynahu najdayn." Allah talking about I've given you your sight and your faculties, and I've shown you the higher path, and the two paths. Do you know what the higher path is? Yeah. And Allah describes the steps that you need to take to be on the higher path. Okay. The first step that you need to take to be on the higher path is faqu raqaba, to free the necks. It means to free the slaves. So if you want to be on the higher path that Allah wants us to be on, the first step on that is to free the slaves. So this idea that we have in our minds that is somehow the slavery is necessary, or I would not have this same. So we need to explain this in a little bit more detail. So there's that verse in the Quran that talks about this. Before Islam came, what was the situation like in terms of slavery? You could go.
Has anybody got that Quranic verse? I can't quite check for it myself at the moment.
The higher path one.
Yeah.
No, I can't say for sure, but this feels like another one where it's actually being manipulated. I think there is a verse towards the end of the Quran where it talks about you've got this low and higher path, and then there's various tests that you can go through to be on the higher path, and from what I remember, it actually says something like freeing a slave is like one of the things that you do on this kind of journey. I can't remember for sure, so again, if we have to correct this later, we can do so, but it's not this, from what I remember, it's not this general thing of just slaves need to be freed. It's more like an individual kind of journey for the righteous Muslim. Is to free a slave. I don't remember it being just generally free all the slaves.
Yeah, and even then, it's probably not altruistic. I mean, there's always these God brownie points, isn't there? With good actions, you get double brownie points. You know, if you do something at certain times of the year and things like that, and freeing a slave can offset your zakat. And
yeah, I mean, to be fair, because I remember reading this verse a while ago in another video on slavery. It did seem to be one of the better verses in terms of it was setting out, look, there is this kind of higher path, this more righteous way to live. I mean, it is connected obviously with leading you to salvation, but it did kind of put it in more of a context of it being a moral act. So like I mentioned before, there are a couple of occasions in Islam where it does point to it not just being like a punishment, but being a moral act, but they're kind of few and far between, and I think this is the verse that he is referring to.
Yeah, but not an obligatory act. I think that's what we always look for, isn't it? It's like at some point there'll be a line in the sand drawn where it'll say slavery is not allowed anymore, just like alcohol was prohibited, and we don't find that in Islam, and that's, as we'll talk about, has led to why Islam has been practicing slavery up until the modern day, and legally in their own countries up until 100 years ago.
Well, yeah, and as I say, I think it just shows the internal contradiction with this, which I was mentioning before, that you know, if Allah's going to allow it, if Allah's going to say that, you know, this is an act to own a slave is not an immoral thing to do, then at a later stage, like I think this verse that he's talking about kind of indicates that it is a moral act to free them. How can it be moral to free somebody when the act of owning them is not considered immoral? An inherent contradiction. The institution itself is not moral. What immorality are you freeing them from? What makes it a moral act, unless being in slavery is a bad thing, which they will argue at all other times that no, slavery under Islam isn't bad. This is complete contradiction as far as I can see.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The passage he's referring to is Surah 90. And it's basically, it's such a tiny surah, it's probably about maybe 16 ayah, 16 verses, and specifically the section he's referring to is where Allah is talking to the Prophet and saying, talking about the people who say that they believe but they haven't been tested, and Allah goes forward to say, you know, we've given them signs, we've given them eyes, tongues and lips. I'm guessing that's some sort of sign. And there are two clear ways it refers to it, which is what I think he's talking about, the paths. And verse 12, it says, what will explain to you what the steep path is? It is to free a slave, to feed at a time of hunger, an orphaned relative, or a poor person in distress. So that's the one he's talking about, yeah.
Right, so it's free a slave, isn't it? It's not free the slaves, plural, which is how he was saying it. It's saying to free a slave.
And then it goes on to say, if you do these things, you gain the reward of being on the right-hand side of God at that time when you go to heaven. So it's more like a trade here. It's being described as.
Yeah, I mean, I could still give. I'd still be willing to say that you could interpret that as laying out a way of living your life, even though yes, you've always got this salvation as the reward whenever you're going to be talking about Islam. But I could at least give them a point to say, yeah, this is a more moral path. You know, you're going to get to heaven because you're doing things better in your life, and so therefore, I'd be willing to grant this particular verse as saying that it's something of a moral act to free a slave. As I say, the 2 points of contention is one, he's basically misrepresented it by saying freeing slaves plural, as if that is basically saying that all the slaves need to be free. That's the higher path. No, it's saying free a slave for an individual Muslim. And secondly, there's the issue of, well, if you are saying it's a moral act, then you've got that internal contradiction, which, you know, we already talked about.
Yeah.
Also, as well, if you notice, it's actually equivocating a few things which don't seem to gel. So as Allah is explaining the things that you can do to obtain this salvation, notice the language. It is to free a slave, to feed at a time of hunger an orphaned relative, or a poor person in distress. So you don't necessarily have to free a slave if you want to, you know, get in good graces. You can just feed an orphaned relative or a poor person in distress. So somehow those are equivalent when Allah is telling you exactly how you're going to obtain salvation. You don't have to free a slave. You just feed a poor person. So how is that equal?
Well, yeah, it sounds like you've got three options here, and you can pick which one you like.
Do you notice how freeing a slave is always juxtaposed between what it's going to cost you and how much it's going to impact you? And it's so freeing a slave and then feeding some poor person. These are acts which are going to come out of your wealth, but they're not. It's not because of any intrinsic goodness that you're doing these things. It's always as to gain something or to pay a penance. So it's, yeah, there's no intrinsic good mentioned in any of these.
Yeah, it makes me think about the economics of this. I mean, if you can get as much reward for freeing a slave as feeding someone, I mean, how cheap were slaves?
The equivalent of a meal.
Yeah, perhaps. In other words,
and that's how Islam views them. Yeah.
They would have been abundant. Yeah.
Mm. And just to be clear as well, this particular verse, which sort of springs out this surah, Surah 90, the city, it just springs out of nowhere. It's 16 lines that's shoehorned into the Quran, and it's really at odds between large swathes of the narrative, which are a little bit more honest about how to treat slaves. So it almost seems like an addition. Now, obviously Muslims would reject that completely, but it just seems to be, okay, here's a nice spot, let's just say free some slaves and do some good, and then let's move on back to the normal narrative. So if you do see it, it's such a tiny surah, and that's what I got from it.
Well, yeah, as I say, I mean, it's few and far between the times when freeing a slave, I would say, is got a slightly more moral character. And to be honest, this is probably the only one I can think of in the Quran. There might be others, but in all the other places, it's absolutely considered like a punishment, or, you know, this is the thing you're going to have to suffer to free a slave, kind of thing. So you're absolutely right. It kind of sticks out like a sore thumb, this one.
And just a quick browse through the Quran just to have a look at other examples of what Allah is saying a good believer is. You immediately find in Surah 23, for example, just the first 2 or 3 ayah, it's those who pray humbly, who shun idle talk, who pay the prescribed alms, which is like charity, who guard their chastity except with their spouses and their slaves. So a good Muslim is one who doesn't have sex with anyone else but their wives and their slaves. So that doesn't immediately sound like you're freeing slaves again, is it?
Delete. You spin on?
Yep.
Anywhere, if you are strong and powerful enough, you see this gentleman walking, just grab them and you enslave.
He's mine now.
He's mine now.
What would happen?
Unlimited sources of slavery. The first thing the Prophet did, every form of trying to obtain a slave was prohibited. Everything, except for one exception. And the one exception was in war.
Yeah.
And we'll explain, and the question is why.
And it's in that context, by the way, that I mean this list.
Sure. Now, and I'll explain what that means. So in that time, when the people would come to fight, to motivate the way the Arabs were, to motivate themselves, they would bring all of their wealth with them, their gold and everything, and they would bring their women and children with them in the battlefield. And the idea was this, that if you see your children and your wife and then you're fighting the enemy, you're going to fight harder. Yeah. So there were many incidents of Al-Tas. You see that the people of Hunayn, they brought the women and the children. And then what happens is when they lose, the men are defeated or killed or they run away. These people are left. They're literally in the battlefield. They're left. Now, this is an age of empires. This is an age of, if you leave
Okay, guys, what do you think of this narrative? Because I find this hilarious, the fact that you're going to war and you're taking everything with you, all of your possessions and your spouses and everything, just so that it would help you to fight harder.
Yeah, they're just over there. You can wave to them as you're swinging your sword. Yeah, it sounds a bit ridiculous, doesn't it?
It even says on the battlefield. You bring them on the battlefield. I mean, as what? As kind of, human shields? And I mean, I suppose there are modern equivalents to that if we look at some parts of the Islamic world. But yeah, I mean, this is absolutely crazy, this narrative. And he might be talking about the idea of societies that were not settled, nomadic societies. Yes, you would have had your possessions and your families amongst the travelling, but you wouldn't set them up next to the battlefield. They would be way, way, way away in a different camp in safety while you were attacking whoever the enemy was. And then once you had secured that area, they would move in. You wouldn't have them next to you on the battlefield. So where he's getting this from, I have no idea.
It was this battle, actually, and the subsequent battle from the people who ran away, because the Muslims did win this battle, and the subsequent battle. But it's where there's hadith about the captured wives comes from, that Muhammad declares divorced and, available to his soldiers.
It's this kind of mental gymnastics which you kind of have to believe in order to follow down this rabbit hole where, oh, you know, we've just defeated your army. Look at all these women on the battlefield looking all distressed. You know, oh well, we can't just leave them there. We've got to do something because we're a good people. Let's pick them out of the dead bodies and take them home and look after them. I mean, it's just mind-boggling, that narrative. Even if there were armies, like Drastic says, where you've got they're transporting everything with them, it's not the basis in order to legitimize a whole act of slavery going forward. Just because some people do it, you would probably be sure that it wasn't the majority case.
Yeah.
The next band of even up to now, subhanAllah, even the next band of people that will come will do whatever they want with these people. So what you do is you take them into your society. Now you can't just free them. So what happens is that there were no prisons as such. There's no prison system. You can't say we're going to put you in prison, etc. What you would do is you would put them you allocate them to the homes of the people who were in the battle. So that basically they become indentured servants. Now, what you would do is you would
Can
keep
you just
the
pause it
families
there a second? Just a very quick point. Acting like there was no such thing as holding someone in captivity in a prison or in a dungeon until the modern era. There were dungeons and prisons for people to be held in the Roman Empire. So this is just a lie. It's a flat out lie. It's an apologetic which is constantly thrown around. Oh, there was no way to hold any prisoners. Not true.
Yeah, he's painting a picture, isn't he? Trying to produce that narrative where, at the end of the day, you can take these women and it's justified.
Well, he's basically trying to pretend that unless you've got some kind of modern 21st century kind of prison system, run by a nation state, there's no way to hold someone in captivity as a prisoner for until you can find out what to do with them long term without just making them a permanent slave. That's a lie. You could you can hold, I mean, you can even hold them people in a camp. The idea of concentration camps and stuff. I mean, obviously it's modern kind of terminology used for it, but you can hold a population in a particular area in captivity for a while until you got a long-term solution with what to do with them. This happened throughout history. So to pretend, oh no, there's no prisons available, so you just have to become a slave for the rest of your life. It's the worst kind of apologetic I can think of for this.
There's also Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, I'm not sure if I'm going to derail your point, but yeah, it's kind of, he offers that, they'll all be shared around the homes, as if like, wherever the village or town that they come from, they're where their families are, they would go back and they'd go, all right, you slave, you go there and you go there and you go there. But it wasn't, it was war booty, Muhammad took a fifth, he's not taking, some small portion of these people that have been captured. He's taking a fifth of them and he's then selling them to make profit for himself. And this is not some kind of Ukrainian goodwill mission where people are offering up their homes for these people to live in. This is, a commercial practice.
Very timely analogy. That's a good one.
Do you want to make your point?
I was just going to say, as he's describing this narrative of how slavery is just some international welfare program, obviously, it's like you sort of imagine that, these guys are scratching their heads and lamenting, oh, wow, we've lost all of our slaves again. Did you put them in the most secure tent? Well, what happened? Did you not lock it? Yeah, of course, they would have had a way to keep slaves and to look after people and make sure they didn't just run away. I mean, I don't understand what threat it would have been anyway if they had let them go back to their village, or I can understand if it's the men, perhaps you would fear some retribution at the end of it, but you could have just allowed the women to return to their lives, and if they wanted to come with you, that's a different case. But you've just sort of slaughtered their entire menfolk, and then you're taking them with you. It's a little bit different.
I also find it kind of ironic because he's also said at one point, oh, you can't leave them there because another tribe will come along, and you're essentially saving them for what the next group might do to them. And it's like, oh wow, so you're preventing them being enslaved by another group by enslaving them. I mean, isn't that a great mercy that you've shown them? It's just absolutely ridiculous.
All right, moving on.
Together.
Yeah.
So if there's a husband and wife who's captured, you'd keep them together. They would stay as husband and wife, and they work together. Families captured you who would keep
just
them
quickly.
Together. Because the idea.
Yeah, this speaks to your earlier point where you were saying, where's the benefit in keeping the husband alive? So I don't really see that you're bringing back many men from this expedition and rehousing them as families. Those men are probably going to be on the battlefield, and if you've got a choice whether to take one back or just take the wife back, I don't see many of them making it.
Well, I mean, the Banu Qurayza, they slaughtered all the men and post-pubescent boys, took all the women and children and prepubescent boys as slaves. I can't imagine there were many men spared in this kind of exchange.
Definitely not.
Isn't to break up these people. Now, if a husband has been killed or a husband is gone now, he's run away, he's not going to come back, and his women are left, and they've been taken into a household, the household they would work within that household. Now, there are certain etiquettes of how you would treat people. Feed them what you eat. Clothe them with what you wear. Do not overburden them. If they are given too much to do, help them with it. These are all statements of the Prophet, peace be upon him, where he's saying that these people are there to help you, really. They are allowed to make contracts to leave you. So there's a famous instance, I can't remember the name of the tribe, where the chieftain's daughter was allocated to a certain home and she wanted to leave. So the owner said, okay, here's a contract. If you can raise this much money, you're free. Now imagine I own you. Why am I going to free you? But you give people ways of working out of this. Do you understand? Now, if other example, if this person...
Just one sec. Okay, so... it's all well and good, right? If the religion says to you, okay, well, if you have a slave and they come to you and they want to leave, work out some sort of contract. But if you're the owner of that slave and that slave is actually providing a service or some work for you, how likely are you going to make that happen? I mean, you can write a slave. You can say, here you go. You just have to raise, I don't know, something ridiculous like £1, and I'll let you go. But by the way, during your entire life as my slave, you're not going to get any salary at all. So what good? How are you going to get freed if the master really doesn't want you to go? And in fact, there are cases in Islam where a slave will be so unhappy with the contract that has been set out with the master that they'll go above them and they'll go to the emir or to the person in charge of the village and complain. So those things did happen. It's not really as, we're going to make a contract. It's going to be to the letter of the law, whatever they had back then. But the master would have just written it in such a way that it would have made them impossible to escape that if they wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, just I looked into the contract thing a while back, and I'm sure it's the case that it's really arbitrary whether the master will give you one. There are criteria you have to meet to be considered for basically this kind of contract. Be of good character. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Does that mean you've got to be a Muslim? Under any of these criteria, there's always going to be those people who just would choose not to live up to that expectation.
Well, I mean, just in that one alone there, Dave, when you're talking about good character, do you have to be a Muslim? Well, when the Quran says that you're the worst of creatures, if you're not, then is that liable to stand up to being of good character? I think almost by default you could argue every non-Muslim is not of good character. Just point to the Quran, and that'd be your get-out clause.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's always these exceptional rules, which, like with the beating, if you've got a good reason to beat them, it's okay. If you've got a good reason to think they're not of good character, you shouldn't free them. There's always these exceptional cases.
Also, let's say you determine that it's not worth it, and the slave wants to go to the higher authority. Well, you forbid them from doing so. Okay, so they try and do it. Well, you're disobeying your master. I'm going to kill you now. And then you don't get to go. I mean, what's the worst that's going to happen to you then? They say, oh, well, you shouldn't have killed that slave, so, free another slave or something, as punishment. But it doesn't help too much. But, in terms of enforcing this so-called right, I mean, you're kind of a difficult position as the slave in doing so. So I just think it's, practical reality is you've got nothing really.
Yeah, I mean, you'd expect some guidance on what the reasonable obligations on the slave would be to kind of fulfill their contract. I mean, it like you were saying, the dispute with the headman over, a slave saying that the criteria were too high for him to meet. That's why wouldn't you lay out some groundwork?
And so, we're about 15 minutes in, I think, to this EFDawah video. But do you notice how Imran and Abbas have this sort of double act going, where they're going to present just the right slant of some of these hadiths, and they're going to traverse this minefield of all these hadith which disagree with them, and they're going to just do a PR exercise on Islam, and you never really get a real flavor of anything that's actually true. You just get these little snippets, ironically, that they're building upon, which they've said before is a really bad way to introduce Islam.
They're kind of being hypocritical in how they say Islam should be treated. I'm genuinely surprised that their interlocutor is so naive. As you said, looking from one hadith to the next one would kind of refute some of these points. The fact that he hasn't checked any of these things up, and he's just listening to this diatribe by the two of them, sunshine and flowers, this is not a way to investigate Islam. Check the sources.
Absolutely.
Wants to get married to somebody else. There's a servant under your care who wants to marry someone else. The owner, the Malik, is told that you do not interrupt this, you do not stop this from happening. These are all within, if you can find the sources for these sorts of statements. Now, the other thing is, okay, then what about this marriage thing? What about having intercourse with these women? What happens to them? If there comes a time, and in that time only, where this person it wants to have intercourse with you or the other way around, and there is no coercion, you're allowed to engage in this. The question is why? What is this? So what is the nikah? The nikah is a contract between actually the father and the groom, with the agreement of the daughter. The father is saying, I have responsibility for my daughter, I've raised her. I'm now handing the responsibility to you. Are you willing to take this responsibility?
This is... The father and the daughter's got to consent. I mean, under certain circumstances, depending on which book of fiqh you're looking at, the status of the daughter, she might not even have a say in it. And there's always that old chestnut of her silence is acquiescence.
Yes.
Yeah, it's... And is he? Yeah, perhaps I've stopped it too soon, but I imagine he's going to compare like the arrangement with a slave to a marriage.
You would say yes. The daughter is asked, "Are you happy with this?" She gives her consent. You understand? So this is a passage of responsibility from one person to another. In the case of where this allocation happens, this responsibility has already been passed. This woman is already under your care. Do you understand?
But in this case, obviously, the concubine...
Yeah, but did she consent, though? That's the point.
Yeah.
You're saying, he also slipped that in as well, talking about without coercion. Well, consent and coercion, it's a completely different dynamic when you're talking about a slave. How did he get this responsibility, this duty of care, if you want to use that kind of terminology. He's got it because this woman has been captured or she's been bought, which is another key thing, which I forgot to pull him up on, because he said there was only one way to get slaves, and that was through war, which is a lie. You can go and buy slaves that already exist. But to get back to the point, yeah, he's got this duty of care, not because it's been passed to him. It's because probably the woman's family is dead. She hasn't got a father because her father's probably been killed in a battle or some other way. And you have this duty of care because she's a slave. So there's no consent there. And by definition, it's going to be coercion, any sex that you're going to have. So completely different scenario.
Yeah, in modern sense, it's explicitly slavery. It's explicitly rape. Because it's in the condition of slavery, it's coercive, and therefore you can't consent. You can't give informed consent, and
but you know, he's saying in a normal marriage scenario that it's, you know, the daughter agrees to whatever contract is being made, but here he's saying, well, no, he's just automatically got the right to do it. He's kind of admitting that there is no, you know, the slave hasn't consented because the rights was automatically passed you. You didn't have to make a contract with anyone except the person you might have bought the slave from. That was it.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. Yeah.
There's a bit in Reliance of the Traveller. I'm not sure if I posted it to you guys. I'm afraid I can't check my sources at the moment, but it basically says that the master can do what he wills with his female slaves. Her concerns, even her enjoyment of the sexual act is of no issue. And you mentioned, of course, the other areas where you might be able to get slaves from, Drastic, and of course the children of slaves, how were they treated? At no point has he mentioned what happens to the children of slaves, and they are themselves slaves.
I've actually got the quote. You did paste it to me. Do you want me to read it?
Yeah, if you got it.
Yeah. So the Reliance of the Traveller, Sacred Law K32.3. The master who owns a woman slave can use her in any way for his sexual pleasure. He can marry her if he wants. In intercourse, the satisfaction of the female slave is not important at all. The female slave does not have to be a Muslim convert. Even if she is pagan, the sexual intercourse is halal, permissible.
Yeah,
wow.
Doesn't sound consensual, does it?
Not at all.
Moving on.
She doesn't have a father.
She's not a concubine. She's not a concubine. Concubine has a certain connotation that she's there for intercourse.
Oh, so what would you call...
brother's just got a verse from the Quran. What's the verse, brother?
ولا تكرهوا فتياتكم على البغاء إن أردنا تحصن ذات. You're not allowed to make them sex slave.
Yes. So if for example, it's a very beautiful verse.
Yeah, this is talking about prostitution, isn't it? It's basically saying you're not allowed to profit from prostitution. But if it does happen, then the prostitute has no fault. It doesn't actually offer any kind of punishment for the pimp.
So do you notice as well the goalposts are slightly changing here very subtly? It started from a discussion whether sexual slavery happens in Islam, to now redefining it and saying, well, the kind of sexual slavery that you're talking about is one where a woman is just passed around the community. Well, you know, that's something else, and you know, that's horrible. But well, actually, no, sexual slavery can just be a master having sex with his slave. She doesn't have any rights, she can't leave. That is a good enough definition for me to say, does Islam have this? And let's focus on that. But he's trying to blow it up into this monstrous condition that this woman is actually being almost tortured, and trying to make an extreme case and then pointing at it and go, yeah, but we don't do that.
Well, I mean, you make a good point, because right at the start, he did actually give the honest question that's being asked. Can owner of a female slave basically have sex with her, force himself upon her? And he's halfway through the video, he's not actually answered the question. It's just dodge to the next thing. So, you know, will we ever actually get to it? Wouldn't want to give you spoilers.
And these women were passed around anyway. I mean, they were sold. So
yeah,
I think there's an inner period, but you know, when you get a new slave as well as a new wife, or potential of a new wife, that you have to wait. But nevertheless, these women were passed around.
And again, let me just quote Surah 23, where Allah describes actually the qualities of a good believer: those who pray, those who shun idle talk, pay the charity, but those, quite importantly, those who guard their chastity, except with their wives or their slaves. So if you're only having sex with your wife and your slaves, Allah gives you a big thumbs up. And that's Surah 23, ayah 1 to 5.
That's good.
Spin on.
Yes. So what this verse is saying is that you're not allowed to exploit them. You can't use these women as prostitutes, etc. You can't do that. Now, if this was a sex slave and you can do whatever you like with them, why the Quranic prohibition on
The
this?
custom at that time. But so pre-Islam, this is what they did. If they managed to overcome a tribe and they took their women,
Islam's there to abolish.
so Islam abolished that. And in fact, the Quran abolished that.
Do you understand? So this idea of exploiting women for their sex is actually alien. Now, if in that scenario, if the woman consents and the man consents, they're allowed to have intercourse because there are human beings have needs. Now, if she wants to marry someone else, you allow that to happen. You don't get in the way of that. Now, those things are I would say they were specifically for the time in which there were no systems of holding people, prisons, etc. available. And many scholars will say now that actually this is no longer something that would be applicable, even in the context of war, because we have other institutions now that will fulfill that role.
Yazidi, sorry?
Verse 33.
33, yeah?
When the Yazidi women were being captured by the ISIS, and they is that for me? SubhanAllah. Would you like one, brother? When they were doing what they were doing to the Yazidi women, yes, the scholars spoke out against this, that you cannot revive this. This was specific because there was a need. And in fact, the interesting thing is this. The interesting thing is, whenever I've asked somebody, okay, what's your solution?
They don't have
they should do this. Oh, well, they should do that.
Do you really think... what scholars is he talking about concerning ISIS and the Yazidi women?
I know.
I mean, Al-Azhar University in Egypt couldn't even excommunicate the ISIS. They refused to.
Yeah. And notice the trend as well. When the conversation starts and the guy presents the question to them, Abbas immediately starts with, well, are you sure he's not just trying to poke holes in Islam? He's sort of trying to poison the well. Just the fact that you're asking a question, which clearly by now we can all see has a basis in Islam, so the question is valid. But he's sort of saying, if you bring this question to us, you're being disingenuous, because obviously Islam is free from all that. And then you've got Imran here sort of saying, well, this was such a long time ago. I mean, why are we still discussing it? It does sort of creep into the area of, well, is this timeless guidance or not? I mean, okay, maybe the exact conditions don't apply, but we're asking, does this situation exist in Islam, in the scriptures? And it just seems like they're really trying to push this discussion away, and you can understand why.
There was also a little bit, I just wanted to pick up on what he said there. He said, well, if you are in this situation, you haven't got these prison systems, so, you've got to have slavery, because apparently that's your only other option. He also said at one point, well, if they want to have sex, because that's okay, because men and women have needs. So when did that suddenly become a thing in Islam? Oh, I've got sexual needs, so that's okay. And also, why is it that if you can't imprison someone, it's not just that you can enslave them, but you can also have sex with them? Why should that be a factor in it? No justification for that. It's saying, okay, if slavery is the only option, why does it also mean basically your body is to be used? Under that, you may as well say, well, okay, in the prison system, you can put these women in prison, but the men still have needs, so they can go in there and have sex with them, a couple of times a week. Why
Exactly.
not? If men and women have needs, it's completely irrational, this line of argument.
Yeah, these are the narratives you have to push to start accepting some of this stuff. It isn't easy.
But he snuck that in, like really sneakily, like, you know, and then moved on. Oh, men and women have needs, so it's okay if they're upset. And I think he also mentioned about if they consent. We still haven't got to the point when where he's shown that a woman needs to give consent as a slave before the master can have sex with her. Still hasn't shown that she needs to give consent.
Yeah, and also it is true, men and women do have needs, but in this context he should have really said men and slaves have needs. She has the need to be set free and he has the need to get laid. It's just
that would be more, that would be a true reflection, wouldn't it? Yeah, like she is the need to be raped.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on.
Yeah.
No solution. But Islam came up with a solution. And though it may be regarded within today's times, not the perfect solution in terms of that they would just be free, live their life happily, and they would be provided for, it was a solution and the best solution of its time.
Any solution, it's impossible to please everyone.
Right. And what we're saying is that, now this is the beautiful thing about Islam. There were no controls like this in human civilization. There was no authority that governed this and limited things. There was no authority that said that if you have a child with her, the child is free, and upon your death, she's free. It didn't exist. There was nothing in human history that said you couldn't just go and capture a free man and sell him. Islam, and according to the Christian Catholic intellectual speaker, Craig? No. The Irish, what's his name? He, as a Christian, he said, the first man in human history that made it a legal obligation that slavery was abolished was the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
Absolute lie. I mean,
yeah.
I knew I was going to pause it there.
Yeah, I mean, to stand there and try to claim that, I just, one of you two, please, because I'm facepalming at the moment. I can't deal with it.
Well, there's not much to say. It's just false, isn't it? There's no abolition of slavery here. I mean, he made that distinction about just running around grabbing, random people. And the rules of taking slaves under a jihad can be seen as that restriction. But this is nothing he's described, nothing that we've talked about is anything close to an abolition of slavery.
And I mean, the man who came there to make slavery forbidden was a slave trader. How can you take that seriously? Muhammad owned slaves himself. Yet here is the man that forbids slavery. Yeah, that really makes sense.
He talked about it historically as well. I mean, the Roman Empire, or 2nd century, they had laws, if I remember correctly, that a slave could, an owner could be prosecuted for the murder of a slave. This is it. When you have a society in which you have a large population of slaves within it, people treating them extremely poorly to the point at which these people have nothing to lose apart from fight, they will fight and you get slave rebellions. So a general kind of code of not taking it too far, though you can still treat them badly, it's just safer for your society. It's about self-interest. It's not about caring about slaves.
Yeah, I mean, even in in the United States, there were, you could be prosecuted for certain, excessive cruelty to your slaves in certain situations, stuff like that. It wasn't just that you were allowed to necessarily do anything. I mean, in practice, obviously, many slave owners did, just as they did in Islam, but there were considered certain restrictions. You shouldn't be excessively cruel, and it differed from state to state, and it differed over time as well. I mean, a slave in America in 1850 was was doing a lot better than a slave in 1750. I mean, it doesn't make slavery any less disgusting and immoral and barbaric, but yeah, this idea that Islam was the only other system that had, you know, all these lovely doubly kind of regulations that were so beautiful for the slaves, and everybody else, it was just like open season on the slaves, and that was it. Lie.
Also, guys, this statement by Abbas, it really triggered me. So, if you'll remember, he said this Craig guy, you know, ... Christian, says that Muhammad was the first person to legally abolish slavery, and I was like, well, no, that doesn't sound right to me. So, and it wasn't William Lane Craig actually. So I went off, I did some research, and I found the guy, Dr. Craig Considine, an American sociologist, and actually he did say that Muhammad was the first man to legally abolish slavery. But guess what? He's a scholar of Islam. He is in no way a Christian. So, yeah, disingenuous again.
Well, we'll have to find out more about that and verify it. Does it make any explicit statements as to his religion?
Well, he's quoted on his own website, an American sociologist who is a scholar of Islam. So he's not a Christian. Maybe at one point he was, but the statements that come from him regarding Muhammad are as he is a Muslim. So there is no Christian doctor that is saying Muhammad, well, at least this doctor isn't saying that Muhammad was legally abolishing slavery. It's a Muslim doctor who perhaps has converted to Islam who's saying that.
Yeah, but you
So
can
again,
get scholars of, you know, Quran, you know, and and there's a lot of guys in Oxford that do, you know, have advanced knowledge on Islam, but they're not necessarily Muslims. It's all my concern is there. I think it'd be nice to have an explicit statement saying, I'm a Muslim or I'm a Christian or whatever.
Yeah, good point.
Shall we move on?
Now, I know there was some slavery that happened. Yes, there was slavery that happened. Even in the Islamic civilization, people who did not abide by those teachings.
But those exceptions should be a norm.
Those are the exceptions, they're not the norm, right? And in fact, what does the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, say? He said, the man who enslaves a free man and consumes his profit, I will be at war with him on the day of judgment. I will be at war. Allah and His Prophet will be at war. So with the person who goes and enslaves a free person and then consumes the Prophet.
So in a nutshell, it goes back to that first criteria that if the Prophet didn't allow.
Second, can we pause that a sec?
Yeah.
What does he mean by consume the Prophet? Does he mean not give Muhammad his cut? The war booty, you know, give him 20% of what the slave is worth or something, because that sounds a very odd way. It's not just goes and enslaves a free man. It says and then consumes the Prophet. So
yeah, it's another one of those criteria, isn't it? Is it actually saying don't enslave the free man, or is it just saying don't enslave the free man and then take the Prophet?
That's what it sounded like he said.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Smile, did you look at that hadith? I didn't know if you got round to it or not. Smile?
Oh yeah, sorry, I was just looking up Dr. Craig Considine. Yeah, you're right. He does claim to be a Christian, but he does believe Muhammad is a prophet. So that's interesting.
Well, that's not Christian, but okay.
Yeah, sorry. No, I didn't look at that hadith, by the way.
Oh, yeah,
okay,
I didn't get a chance either.
Maybe we can have a look at that later. And
yeah, it seemed really vague. I'm wondering if it's even going to look like how he pronounced it, but we'll see.
He's definitely not going to allow her to be harmed. And that really finishes the discussion.
Yeah,
you know what
it does.
Yeah. Alhamdulillah, inshallah.
I was supposed to send this the video, but I was just going to ask about it. If the husband passed away, should get like some of the inheritance? Like, she entitled to?
I'm not sure of this. I'm not sure. I
Notice how they recoil at the subject of inheritance. It's hilarious.
Oh, don't get me started.
They know it's a massive pitfall and it's an immediate, oh, we don't know about this. This is way beyond us.
Yeah, it's, what was it, Rain Man math. Yeah.
Yeah, that's Hamza, Rain Man mathematics.
Yeah.
Adding fractions, yeah.
But now what you're talking about is like supererogatory benefits of, do you understand? So we're well beyond the, are you mistreating them? With like, what other benefits do they get?
Okay, I'll just ask this just a joke, but that's fine.
I mean, the fact that we're instructed, feed them what you eat. Clothe them the way you're clothed. In other words, don't give them torn rags.
And they don't pay zakat, by the way.
Yeah. And they don't have to pay zakat.
Yes.
And don't overburden them with work. If they're in servitude to you, you can't basically say, right, you're doing 16-hour shifts. Start digging ditches.
Oh, pause it there. I would love to see the hadith which says you can't give them a 16-hour shift. I mean, if he can produce that, then I'm converting to Islam, quite frankly.
It's in the 0 hours contract of the hadith. You have to look really hard.
So, this is just something that just came to me. It says you've got to give them the food that you eat. You could interpret that as just like, yeah, you can give them a scrap from your table once you finish your meal. You know, they can have the bits that are left. Technically, they're eating the same meal as you, aren't they?
Yeah, same with the clothes. I mean, your cast-offs would be the clothes you wear, so
Yeah. So, yeah, not quite as good as it sounds.
No, don't overburden them. And just for a slap, the Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, free the slave. Free this person.
There are so many rulings in Islam. Like if you want to raise your status, purify, free the slave.
Free a slave.
Oh, yeah.
I've done this wrong. What should I do? Free the slave. It was just a mechanism for trying to minimize this as much as possible. And it comes from that verse in the Quran which says, free the slaves.
The wife of the Prophet, Aisha radiallahu anha, she said, it became so difficult for us to do this righteous deed because we couldn't find anybody that was still left in this servitude, which is the modern way of saying slavery.
Did we find anything on that one?
No.
No.
I don't know about this hadith, but it just sounds like absolute rubbish. You know, considering that slavery has been ubiquitous throughout Islamic history, I can't imagine there was ever a time when they were running out of slaves because they, freed so many.
Yeah, well, exactly. Oh no, we're going to have to start feeding the poor instead.
No. We'll have to start enslaving some new people so we can start freeing them again.
Yeah, I mean, considering actually that they went pretty much on a, colonial kind of imperialist takeover of the whole of North Africa and into Spain, and slavery was all part of that, then the flow of slaves didn't ever stop. So
yeah. And the Quran does talk about how I think it's, let me just bring it up, Surah 33 verse 50, Prophet, we've made lawful for you the wives whose bride gift you have already paid, and any slaves God has assigned to you through war. So it's a valid mechanism for picking up new slaves. Just go and fight new people.
Yeah. And they did for a long, long time.
Yeah, we did.
Okay, we could not find anyone that we could go and pay and free because everyone was basically freeing them to try to attain righteousness, which is what the Quran said. So, subhanAllah, when they quote these things,
And nobody was none of the poor were getting fed because they just had such an abundance of slaves.
Yeah.
There's poor guys, never got
a lot of people starved to death, but that's,
Yeah.
fuck them, it doesn't matter, does it?
So what you can't do is you can't take away certain systems overnight. It wouldn't work. Imagine a society that has slavery within it, and then you free everyone. There's no one to do pick the crops. There's no one to do the economy would just crash.
Yeah.
So what you do is you have to do it in a sensible way. You have to systematically break it down and get rid of it. The same way the alcohol, you can't suddenly say stop. America tried it in 1920s. They tried to ban alcohol.
Yeah, no, I remember learning about
It didn't work.
No, but I'll go further. Just imagine that at that time you abolished slavery. Now you have all these slaves who need to be fed and clothed and housed. Now I'm a businessman. You know, my parents, you know, we're from India. We're Gujaratis, right? We're proper business people.
I'm from Bangladesh.
The Jews and the Gujaratis, the Indian Gujaratis, we're known for like entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
You know what I would start doing? Okay. So now there's all these free slaves. Under Islam, if they're under my servitude, they need to eat what I have to eat, clothe the way I have to clothe. I can't overwork them. I can't take advantage of them. Hey, that's all gone now. You're not in my servitude anymore, mate. I need my fields done, but guess what? You know, you had...
I mean, isn't this a terrible argument? He's basically saying if he was given opportunity, he'd be even worse than what we're reading about.
Yeah, and he's also saying this logistical nightmare of having to look after your slave. I mean, God forbid that you look after them, but on the other hand, you're getting completely free labor and all these other things that a slave provides. So, yeah.
Well, you're certainly going to have to do something about your sex needs, aren't you? If they're no longer being fulfilled by your slaves.
Yeah, the idea that you're going to give up. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it is a complete contradiction, because like 2 seconds before, Imran saying, if you free all the slaves, then economic collapse, you know, everything's going to fall apart. And Abbas is saying, oh yeah, well, you know, the system of upkeeping your slaves, it was so generous, you know, so much material benefit for the slaves that as a businessman, this is actually even better. I can make more profit because I'm not going to have to give them the clothes that they need. And, you know, it doesn't matter. But, you know, even if I give them a wage, they're going to be worse off. So he's making the complete opposite argument 2 seconds later, that actually slavery was this really nice thing, and it's actually even better for an unscrupulous businessman. It's going to be less of a financial burden to employ them. You don't have to give them all the nice clothes and the nice food and everything. So which is it? Is it collapsing the economy because you've lost the labour? Or is it going to improve the economy because you don't have to treat them in this lovely way that Islamic slaves were treated? It can't be both, and yet each of them has argued the opposite position, and they're smiling at each other like goons, as if that makes sense.
Yeah, you can't weave this narrative without contradicting yourself, as we've seen. It's cringy.
Yeah, it can't be done, but here's how it could be done. You know, I mean, it's crazy.
And they can only get away with this because they know this guy that they're talking to really isn't going to, either he's not knowledgeable enough at this point to sort of say, well, what about this and how about that? I mean, I think they're taking advantage of him a little bit here.
I think they take advantage of a lot of people's politeness at the corner. And I think this guy's, for the most part, being polite. He's not looking for confrontational dialogue. And yeah, they tend to run away with it. And they are, especially Abbas, they do rub it on.
Yeah, it's a perfect audience, isn't it? Somebody that's not going to argue back against everything that you're saying. So you become more emboldened and you bring out more of these hadith, and you just end up with this crazy narrative at the end of how, again, slavery is just some massive welfare system.
Yeah. Moving on.
Saying, I'm not giving you that anymore. You know the food that I used to eat? I used to have some nice chicken or nice lamb or whatever.
I'm not sharing that with you. No.
I ain't sharing that. You're on beans from tomorrow, mate.
Wow.
You're on lentils. Yeah, you're on barley bread, dried barley bread. What is left over, what I eat, whatever is left over as what the peasants got in this country, right? That's what you're eating. So what would actually happen?
That's exactly what they're required to provide them. What they eat.
Exactly. It's nice to know that outside of Islam, if he wasn't a Muslim, it sounds like Abbas would be happily creating the largest slave empire you've ever seen, Branston style. So
I just like the idea. I've got this image in my head of all these slaves in Islam just sitting around to eat their lobster dinner, their 5-course dinner, and they've got the best wines that money can buy, and they're just living it large. God bless slavery.
I mean, isn't Abbas basically just explaining now, as a slave master, he wouldn't be feeding them everything that he ate? he'd just be feeding them what's religiously required.
Yeah, he'll have the nice piece. He'll have the nice piece of lamb, and they can have the bone to chew on, like a dog, you know.
Bit of skin, maybe, if they're lucky.
Is that those people would end up losing the very rights that Islam gave them under servitude.
We're not advocating for it, but that's a consequence.
Yes, that would be the consequence.
Just clarify that for the camera.
And what would that lead to, Abbas? Please tell us. So suddenly you've lost the, rights of being beaten if they've been naughty, and somebody can coercively have sex with you. I mean, what's going to happen now, Abbas? These people are wandering around, finding work, and how terrible is that?
Exactly.
He is essentially. I mean, he walks it back in a second, but he has essentially, and I think he realises it was why he walks it back, that he has just advocated for the reintroduction of slavery. You're losing the rights that you would get as a slave. I mean, it's terrible. I mean, and either he walks it back, or I think maybe Imran kind of does on his behalf. But you can see, look at the joy on his face talking about slavery. There were so many rights. I mean. Oh dear, it is worrying if these people had power, what kind of world we would have.
Yeah, certainly.
SubhanAllah, of course we're not advocating for that. And I hope as a Muslim, coming from Gujarati roots, I wouldn't do that.
They're going to think you're evil.
But what I'm trying to say to you is that people lose the nuances of a discussion, and they single out one statement, and they try to build a picture that doesn't even exist.
The whole false narrative.
There's no context to what they're saying.
Did you want to comment?
So ironic.
So these people would have actually been...
So ironic, right? We've picked out points where they've been deliberately obtuse and somewhat disingenuous, and they're building a whole narrative off that. You've got to, it's like a trail of dominoes. You've got to believe that war happened in a certain way with the women on the battlefield. You've got to believe that slavery was some sort of welfare system that gave them rights, and there's just so many things you need to believe in sequence to believe this narrative. And you can see just by even slightly changing your angle and looking at some of these quote unquote hadith and facts, they just don't hold up. And he's doing exactly what he's saying that you shouldn't. He's building a whole narrative on snippets of a hadith here and there, and he's just not looking at everything together in totality.
Yep.
In a more detrimental situation. If the bandits didn't get them, then the pagans would have got them, and they would have prostituted them, which Islam banned, okay? And they would have been put into slavery for the rest of their life without ever being free. And if they uttered a word against the owner, as Bilal did, radiyallahu anhu, right? When he was told that, I'm your master, and you stop basically saying La ilaha illallah, that there is none worthy of worship except Allah. And for that reason he was tortured nearly to death.
Said ahad,
Allah is one. Right? Now, if he was a freed person, the pagans would have killed him. But the Muslims came. Abu Bakr radiyallahu anhu came, and he paid heavily to the pagan who owned him and freed him. Paid heavily.
Has anybody ever seen any evidence Bilal was freed? I've never seen anything. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Abu Bakr takes over his ownership after Muhammad dies. Yeah,
that's how I remember it. But I mean, what kind of freedom do you get in Islam? You become instantly a slave to something else, to an all-powerful force that wants to roast you if you put one foot wrong. It's almost like from going from the frying pan to the fire, I think.
I just think, again, the irony is he's saying, we're protecting them from being enslaved for the rest of their lives by enslaving them for the rest of their lives. I mean, it's just so ridiculous, this apologetic.
Triple the price.
Because the way that's described is when Abu Bakr offered the money, I'll give this much, and he said, "No, this is twice what." He took it and he said, "This is twice what he's worth."
Abu Bakr said he would have paid way more.
He said, "I've been given 20 times."
Yeah.
So if you understand the value of a human being, I mean, human beings in Islam, human beings are intrinsically valuable, which is why taking of one life is like you taking all of mankind, because human beings are.
On Smmmile.
We love this, don't we? We love this. Does anyone want to dismantle this one?
You do this, Smmmile. You do it.
Okay. Well, yeah. Obviously, it gets brought up by Muslims a lot. This particular passage from the Quran is Surah 5. Surah 5, verse 32. And it says, "We decreed to the children of Israel that if anyone kills a person, unless in retribution for murder or spreading corruption in the land, it's as if he kills all mankind." So we can see already there that particular verse refers to the children of Israel. It's not a blanket statement to everyone. But more importantly, if you just read the very next ayah, ayah 33, it's completely undone. So it says, "Those who wage war against God and his messenger and strive to spread corruption in the land should be punished by death, crucifixion, and the amputation of the alternate hand and foot." Now that doesn't sound as peaceful, really, does it?
No, it's not turn the other cheek, is it?
It isn't. It's far from it. But obviously he doesn't go ahead and quote the very next ayah, just like he doesn't look at the very previous hadith. He's being very specific, and he's building a narrative of snippets. It's just ironic.
I'd go so far as to say that is the most often misquoted, and I would say deliberately misquoted, in terms of only quoting part of the passage of the Quran that I think exists in apologetics. I've just heard it 1,000 times. I'm sure you both have as well.
Yeah.
And considering that the message they're portraying is the exact opposite of what is being said, makes it even worse. It's not just a little bit of bullshit. It's diametrically opposed to what they're trying to pretend the message is. And therefore, I just can't call somebody who does that anything other than deliberately being dishonest. I mean, it's essentially a lie of omission by not reading that second part.
Yeah, it always walks hand in hand with Islam is peace, doesn't it? You know, it's all that little bundle of apologetics. Yeah.
There may be no compulsion in religion. That probably is up there as well. But I think it's just as Smmmile points out. You've only got to read the next bit to get the actual context of what that means, and it's the exact opposite.
Yeah, and I don't think we can really keep being charitable to these two after. I mean, you could say the earlier mistakes, maybe they didn't look at the earlier hadith here and there, but it's just a pile of evidence showing that they are trying to build this really unique narrative that it's not really honest. And you can probably tell they've done this together before many times, and they just happen to be in front of somebody who's so unknowledgeable about anything. They're kind of running wild.
I wonder if it's that they are themselves unknowledgeable, and this is all because we see this at the corner quite a lot from the Dawah crew. Is they're not that well informed. They don't read their own sources. I mean, Hamza joined Islam, did his shahada, and then said, "What's next?" You know, and this guy's at the corner all the time arguing for Islam, and he's never read hadith. He hadn't read the Quran. You know.
But this guy's supposed to be a doctor. I mean, surely that involves some level of academic qualification.
But I don't know if he practices anymore, or how long ago he did, or I mean, we talked about like the account he has for the semen coming from between the backbone and the ribs, and that whole line of apologetics was terrible and not medical.
I mean, whatever his doctorate is in, and I'm guessing it's some sort of medical field, but he hasn't shown any intellectual rigor at all in his arguments. It can only be because he's being deliberately obtuse and trying to spin a certain narrative. So it's in the very least, it's disingenuous.
Yeah.
I think
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think we're probably coming up to the 2-hour mark on this.
wow.
1 hour 44.
1 hour 44. Oh,
Mm.
okay. Oh, yeah, I think we did start a bit late. Okay, no, fair enough. Yeah, I was going to suggest we spin on, but I mean, sorry, Dave, it sounded like you had another point to make.
Oh, no, it's cool. Yeah, let's move on a little quicker, I think. It's only a few minutes left, and I doubt they're going to do anything but reiterate the same bad points over and over again until the end. So let's move on.
Let's do it.
Special creation. We are a special creation. We're not like anything else.
And Bilal was a black slave. And in the pagan Arab civilization, they were the lowest of society. And what did Islam do?
You can't have it both ways. You can't basically talk about, Islam being non-racist and then start playing the race card concerning slavery. I mean, there are hadith that basically, we talked about these recently, about the 2 black slaves for the 1 non-black slave. And the inference there would be that, black slaves were cheaper than the non-black slaves. You could make that case. And in this way, he's talking about Bilal being black. It tells you nothing about how racist the society was at the time.
And also, I mean, it harks back to a comment he threw away earlier in the video where he said, oh, yes, there was some slavery, there were some people who weren't, following the right law. Well, 15 million plus East African slaves taken through, the Ottoman Empire. That would suggest to me that black lives didn't matter too much for these guys, I would say.
Yeah, and some of the practices carried out on the male slaves were, they were barbaric even by the Atlantic slave trade standards. So,
castration and...
Yeah.
Elevated him to a stature where the other Sahaba, the noblemen of Arabia, were jealous of him.
First person to
first person to call the call of prayer, the one who stood on top of the Kaaba, and when the Caliph were answering the matters, the concerns of the people, Bilal was in front, and the noblemen who had now recently accepted Islam, they said, look at our condition.
But we know Islam is an equal.
Look at our condition, that these people who are the lowest of society, today we are standing behind them. And then what did the Sahaba, I think Amr said to him? They responded to the call while we stood back. So their level is higher than any one of us. A black man from Africa, a slave, but Allah elevated him. Prophet Muhammad elevated him. Islam elevated him above many of the companions who were Arab noblemen, yet he was elevated above them. Alhamdulillah, so we have nothing to be embarrassed about.
It was a literal elevation. They sent him up on top of the Kaaba every day, like a few times a day. So I'm sure that's not what they mean, but it's kind of funny, right? We need to figure out a call to prayer. Let's just send this guy up and let's tell him it's some secret. No, actually not some secret. Some honor that you're going to gain some satisfaction in the eyes of your Lord. So off you go, off you pop. Do that every day, 5 times a day. It's not exactly an honor, is it?
No, it's a chore.
Yeah.
I mean, Bilal also, you see him pretty much with Muhammad a lot of the time. He seems to behave like a kind of bodyguard. I mean, there was a Muhammad's hassling 2 women outside in relation to the hadith about, why there are going to be more women in hell than men. Bilal's with Muhammad at that time, and they're just trying to coerce these women into giving them money. So it doesn't surprise me that Bilal would be sitting near the front. He's boss's man. He's this whole fantasy of, this is like some Martin Luther moment. It just, I don't buy it.
of servitude. It's a very comprehensive, and this is the beauty about Islam. It's not simplistic. People assume it's a simplistic thing. There are so many nuances, so many teachings that are taken into consideration when we judge this matter. Superficially, anything can look wrong. But when you delve below the surface, you realize, subhanallah, praise be to Allah, is so intricate, so detailed, so elaborate, mashallah.
That's what I told you. I said it's so easy to judge face value. It's so easy to complain and go on rants, but if you can't actually provide a feasible solution, then I suggest it's better to stay quiet.
So, yeah, so these are, I mean, I'm not too impressed with these sorts of things that your friend has mentioned. I think connect with him as a human being. You know, you have to have friends before. You have to be mindful, because if you're not influencing him, then he's influencing you. So you want to make sure that you have good other Muslim friends that you're in contact with, your deen is strong, and then you want to keep the connection, because you never know when Allah can turn his heart, inshallah, and bring him closer to, and just keep discussing with him nicely. If you want, bring him on one of our streams. We're happy to talk with him.
He doesn't need to show his face.
I'll definitely
Also,
try,
the brothers at Sapiens and the sisters at Sapiens Institute,
Pause it a sec.
they have, mashallah.
Yeah.
I can't remember. I think from this point on, they're not really addressing the issue again, unless I'm mistaken. Do they pretty much just waffle on about this? You know, talk to this guy, talk to that guy. We'll talk again at some point. I'm not. Is there much content after this point? I can't remember.
I don't remember either. I don't know if there's any more points to pick on. Do you remember, Smmmile?
I think both of them have shot themselves in both feet by this point. Yeah, there isn't much else.
Well, I would suggest then that it's worth pointing out at this point that fundamental question has still not been answered. Is a slave owner, male slave owner, able to have sex with his female slaves, and is she allowed to resist those advances? And as far as I'm concerned, no one has put up any information from the Hadith and the Quran that says that a woman's got any right to refuse that sexual advance. So essentially, it is a sex slave. She is still a sex slave by any reasonable definition. And they've advanced nothing. They've basically just dodged one unrelated issue to another.
Can I just comment on this last bit before we kind of get to closes, because that's where you're heading?
Yeah, no, I mean, it wasn't. I just wanted to kind of like highlight that point that, you know, we are nearly at the end, and he still hasn't answered the fundamental question.
I'm kind of happy to leave it here, so yeah, we can wrap up. I don't think there's anything else after this that's going to be worth talking about. But I just wanted. It's like this. They're talking about his friends. So his friends posed him some questions he's found difficult, and he's come to them for advice. And now they're basically telling him, "Oh, you shouldn't have a friend like that." You know.
Yeah, good point. Very good point. Actually.
Yeah, if your friend challenges you, then we'll, you know,
find some isolate yourself from that. Yeah, isolate yourself from any opinion. Yeah. Just stay away from anybody who dares question if there's, you know, sexual slavery in the Quran, where the Quran, again, it's littered with places which talks about this stuff, and they haven't provided anything at all resembling any kind of defense.
No, yeah, I would agree. I genuinely think this is a very, very weak attempt to... If the guy they were talking to wasn't so glossy-eyed, I'm sure the conversation could have been a little deeper. You know, if he had some of the hadith that we've mentioned, I think they would have been on, you know, difficult ground. But as it is, they've just narrated a lovely, rosy-coloured glasses view of Islam, and it's just not supported in the text.
And also remember as well that they're trying to create this version of events where a man will have a slave, and she has all these rights that he can't impinge upon her any of his own desires. But if you recall that when the wife of a Muslim man refuses his sexual advances, and obviously she's elevated in terms of status in that household, There is a hadith, Sahih Bukhari 3237, which said, Allah's messenger said, if a husband calls his wife to his bed to have sexual relations and she refuses and causes him to sleep in anger, the angels will curse her till morning. So that's how Islam deals with a wife not providing sexual services. So are we really going to assume then that a slave is going to have more rights than that and be able to say no? I don't think so.
No, it seems
It's a great point. That's a great point. And I think fundamentally, what we do know from the text is that a Muslim man does have the right to own female slaves and does have the right to have sex with them. That is not under dispute. Their claims that she's got all these rights, they provided no real textual basis for any of it. They just keep repeating the claim and then dodging onto other kind of unrelated or semi-related issues, things like prostitution and stuff, which is not dealing with the fundamental issue of, can he just have sex with her and she can't do anything about it, she has to submit to it. And they provided nothing in that. The very fact of what we understand about slavery is that you have to obey your master, means that it's perfectly reasonable to say that she would have no right to not consent to it. As far as I'm concerned, they've completely lost on this. I think all the text is behind the position that says, yes, you have a sex slave. They provided nothing to counter it.
Yeah, none of the actual points they raised, the possibility of manumission, that wouldn't affect this, eating and being clothed in the same way as the master, that's not going to have any effect on this. I mean, and, you know, as... They're just, wow, I'm not impressed that, this is the kind, this super elevated standard of slavery that they're claiming Islam provides.
Yeah. It's a really poor double act of half truths and just they're just spinning the best possible version of Islam. If you stand on one leg and squint from the corner as if Islam suddenly looks beautiful from that angle, but it's just a total fabrication, really, isn't it? It doesn't take much of an examination for everything to fall apart.
Yeah. Okay, then. So I think we're going to wind up, aren't we? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So does sexual slavery exist in Islam, gents? What do you think? Final thoughts?
100%.
Same here.
Yeah. You with us on that, Drastic?
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, so a 4-to-1 review kind of ratio here, but there are two of them, so it's taken us 4 times as long to review their video.
Time well spent. I definitely enjoy these, and if the people listening do have any ideas of other ones or they do enjoy this, just let us know in the comments. We do read them.
Cool.
Absolutely, yeah. And we'll give people a chance to join our Discord if they want to discuss this further when this goes out. So look forward to feedback.
All right. Night, people, and cheers, guys. I enjoyed it.
Thanks a lot, guys.